For 30 long years, Silas Blackwood has been the sole keeper of a 100-acre silence in Harmony Creek, Nebraska, a man weathered not by time alone, but by the relentless weight of memory. Every sunrise paints the prairie dust in his lungs a little thicker, a gritty physical testament to his bond with this unforgiving land that holds him captive. Every sunset mocks him with the ghost of a promise Eleanor broke, a single fracture that split his life in two. It was never just about the money they lost, a tangible thing he might have recovered. It was the us he thought was carved in stone, the shared future that vanished like a mirage on the horizon. Her wrong choice became his life sentence, a primordial wound that continues to fester in the dry, cracked earth of his farm and the hollowed-out chambers of his heart. The profound silence of the prairie became his only confidant, the vast, empty sky his only witness. So he digs. Under the gnarled, balding arms of the old oak that has seen more seasons than he can count, Silas is preparing his final resting place. The repetitive motion of the shovel, the strain in his back, the sweat stinging his eyes, it feels like the only honest work he has done in decades. This is more than digging a hole. It is a slow, deliberate ritual of burial. He is interring a grudge the size of the Nebraska prairie, staging a quiet rebellion against a world that kept spinning after his own lurch to a violent halt. The rhythmic percussion of the shovel is his only prayer, a hollow thump, thump, thump against the hardpan that speaks Eleanor's name, without him ever having to part his lips. He has almost convinced himself that this work, this self-made grave, is the end of the story, a final, definitive full stop he can carve into the earth himself, a conclusion written on his own terms, the only terms left to him. If stories of profound loss, quiet rebellion, and the weight of memory resonate with you, subscribe. We bring you character-driven narratives that stay with you long after the credits roll. My days are measured in silence, marked only by the slow crawl of shadows across the dusty floorboards. I've built my life on this patch of forgotten land, a fortress of solitude designed to keep the world out and my ghosts in. Every morning, the reflection in the tarnished mirror shows me a man I barely recognize, his eyes holding a bruised stillness, a familiar emptiness that speaks of battles lost long ago. My voice is a forgotten tool, rusted from disuse, and the quiet is a heavy blanket I pull tightly around myself. I have been digging for years, turning the soil of my memory, burying myself one shovelful of regret at a time. He materialized at the edge of the property line, a stark silhouette against the bleached-out sky. A boy, no older than 10, dwarfed by a flannel shirt that draped over his bony shoulders like a scarecrow's borrowed coat. He was all sharp angles and quiet intensity, and in his hands he clutched a faded, time-worn envelope, holding it not like a piece of mail, but like a sacred text, a last will and testament. My first instinct, the one honed by a decade of isolation, was to send him packing with a snarl. "Private property," I grumbled, the words cracking in the dry air, tasting of dust and loneliness. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He simply stood his ground, a small, unmovable sentinel, and his posture held a stubborn resilience that was so achingly familiar it made my chest tighten. His name, he whispered into the oppressive quiet, was Leo. The name felt alien on my land, a strange seed planted in barren ground. And the letter, he said, his gaze locking with mine across the distance, was for me. For me. I am a monument to things best left undisturbed. I have no room for correspondence, no space for visitors in this mausoleum of a life I've so carefully constructed. But in his eyes, I saw it. The same haunted stillness, the same old sorrow I see in my own. He was an emotional mirror, reflecting a fragile version of myself I thought had been shattered and swept away decades ago. Before I could find another word, he took a single, deliberate step over the property line. It was not a trespass. It felt more like a crossing, a journey over a river I'd thought impassable. He held the envelope out, the paper trembling slightly in his grasp. This boy, and the sealed, silent words he carried, represented the one thing I feared more than oblivion, a reason to stop digging. His hand trembled as he took the envelope. It wasn't the violent shock of expected bad news, but a low, persistent tremor that had become a familiar companion. For weeks, he had braced himself for a different kind of letter, one with a sterile, official letterhead from a lawyer or the bank, come to deliver the final, definitive blow to his failing legacy. This, however, was something else entirely, an artifact from a forgotten time. The looping, elegant script that adorned the envelope was a ghost, a calligraphy he knew better than his own. It was Eleanor's, his Eleanor. The name, unspoken for so long it felt foreign on the tongue, echoed in the silent, hollow chambers of his memory, dislodging years of carefully constructed apathy. Suddenly, the past was no longer a book he had slammed shut and left to gather dust. It had been ripped open, its pages scattered, transforming into an intricate, confounding riddle thrown at his feet. And the small, silent boy standing before him, with his solemn gaze and worn-out clothes, was inexplicably the key. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight, the words barely escaping his constricted throat. The boy, Leo, merely shook his head, his wide eyes fixed on the man's face, searching for a reaction he couldn't yet name. "She said you'd know what to do," he offered, a simple phrase freighted with an impossible weight of trust and expectation. It was a ridiculous, nonsensical thing to say, a message from the past delivered by a child, but he was too stunned, too unmoored by the sight of that handwriting to argue. A silent, resentful agreement was forged in the tense air of the kitchen. Letting Leo stay was a transaction, a cold exchange of services, a roof over the boy's head in return for the story behind that letter. It was a story the boy claimed not to know, but the man was certain it was locked away inside him, a secret held in the quiet depths of his gaze. Their days soon fell into a grudging rhythm, a routine built of shared chores and long, heavy silences. This fragile, tense new world was constantly punctuated by the simmering threat of his neighbor, Henderson. A man of voracious ambition, Henderson's relentless efforts to buy out his failing land felt less like business and more like a personal, calculated attack. Henderson was the embodiment of the world that had moved on, prosperous and indifferent to the wreckage it left behind. He was the future the man had failed to secure, and now, standing in his dusty kitchen, was a boy who felt like the world that had stopped right along with him, a living relic of a time he thought he had buried forever. They started with the fences under a vast, indifferent sky. The old wire, rusted through and sagging between weathered posts, seemed to mock him. It was an easy, if painful, metaphor for a life that had lost its tension. With practiced hands, he showed the boy how to stretch a new line, the metal groaning as he pulled it taut before stapling it securely. The boy, a silent apprentice, followed his movements with intense concentration. His small hands, surprisingly steady, mimicked the man's actions, creating a rhythm of work between them, a shared, unspoken purpose that temporarily filled the void. The air smelled of dry grass and the sharp, metallic tang of the new wire. Then, out of the quiet hum of their labor, the boy's voice, clear and innocent, cut through everything. "Was she pretty?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow, stopping the man mid-swing. The staple gun felt impossibly heavy in his hand. It hung in the air between them, more solid than the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years, had walled her memory off so completely that hearing it alluded to by this child felt like a trespass. He swallowed, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. She was more than that, he finally managed, the syllables feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. How could he explain the vibrant totality of a person with a single inadequate word? He searched for a truth that wasn't steeped in the bitterness of loss. She was like the first warm day after a long winter. The boy considered this, his brow furrowed for a moment, and then he just nodded. It was a simple, solemn gesture of acceptance, as if this comparison to a changing season made all the sense in the world. As they resumed their work, the comfortable silence now charged with this new, fragile connection, a cloud of dust billowed on the distant road. Henderson's battered truck slowed as it passed, its rumbling engine a familiar, unwelcome intrusion. Henderson didn't wave. He never did. He just watched them, his gaze a palpable weight, a silent judgment the man could feel pressing on his skin from 100 yards away. For the first time, however, the neighbors' scrutiny felt different. Henderson's presence was no longer a primary threat, but merely a dull, external distraction from the far more powerful ghost who had just materialized right beside him, the one with the boy's voice, asking about the color of Eleanor's eyes. A few days later, with the pantry shelves looking bleak, Silas had no choice but to make the grim trip into town. The grain co-op always felt like a courtroom where his sentence had been passed long before he arrived. The usual hush fell over the men as he walked through the door, their pitying gazes sticking to his worn coat like burrs. And there, of course, was Henderson, the very picture of prosperity, conversing effortlessly with the manager and glancing over accounts. He acknowledged Silas with a polite, empty nod. "Silas," Henderson said, his voice unnervingly even. "Heard you've got a helper out at your place." The speed of gossip was relentless. Silas could only manage a grunt in reply, grabbing a heavy sack of flour and heading for the counter. He could feel Henderson's eyes fixed on his back, but the look wasn't one of pity. It was something else, something he couldn't place, an expectant quality, as if Henderson was waiting for something. The whole town felt like it was waiting for him to finally give up, and seeing Henderson there, so capable and forward-looking, just poured salt in a wound Silas thought couldn't possibly get any deeper. The flyer for the town hall meeting was tacked to the co-op's bulletin board. "A new vision for Harmony Creek," it read, with Henderson's name at the bottom as the spearhead for a new agricultural cooperative. The man who stood before it saw the notice for what it was, the final public push to swallow his land, to erase the Blackwood name from the valley. He drove home with a loaded-for-bear heart, the injustice of it all burning in his chest. For the following week, he walked the floors of his quiet house, a restless energy propelling him as he practiced speeches in his head, listing all the ways Henderson and the town had wronged him. He would finally have his say. Leo watched him pace, his own expression unreadable. "Are you going to yell at them?" Leo asked one evening as his friends stared out the window at Henderson's distant lights. "I'm going to tell them the truth," the man said, the words tasting like ash. He was going to make them see the ghost he saw, the promise they had all let die. When he stood up in the drafty town hall, the angry words he had prepared caught in his throat. The faces looking back at him were not cruel, but simply tired. The weathered faces of farmers and shopkeepers, each burdened with their own silent struggles. His grand speech about legacy and betrayal dissolved on his lips, emerging only as a broken whisper about failure. In that stark moment, he saw himself for what he had become, a bitter old man clinging to a patch of dust. He recognized the look of pity in their eyes, a sentiment he despised, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He sat back down, the ensuing silence more damning than any argument. It was then that his gaze drifted to the back row. Leo wasn't looking at him with pity. The boy's eyes held a different light, one that saw a hero who had just lost a battle, but not the war. That unwavering belief was a tiny, warm light in the cold room. The humiliation was immense as he walked out, but a small hand slipped into his. It wasn't the touch of pity. It was an anchor, grounding him in a world that had not yet given up on him. That night the sky broke open. A summer storm, as violent and sudden as his own grief, rolled in from the west. The rain descended not in sheets, but in walls of water, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. He knew immediately that the creek would swell. The lower fields, the only ones with a sliver of a chance of producing anything that year, would be the first to go. Panic, A feeling he hadn't truly felt in decades seized him. For 30 years, he had been letting the place die slowly alongside him. But now, faced with its sudden execution, an instinct to protect it roared to life. He grabbed a slicker and a shovel, his mind racing. He was no longer just the keeper of a memory. He was the defender of a fragile, living thing, about to face a storm that had a different name than grief. When he burst out the door into the chaos, a small figure in a too-big coat was already at work, dragging sandbags from the old shed. It was Leo. The boy had not waited for instructions. He had seen the problem and immediately started working. They didn't speak. There was no sound but the howling wind, the lashing rain, and the frantic scrape of their shovels against the damp earth. They toiled side by side in the storm-swept darkness, not as a man and a boy, but as partners. They moved with a shared, desperate rhythm, piling bags against the rising water, their movements starkly lit by intermittent flashes of lightning. In that moment of shared struggle against a force they could neither blame nor resent, he felt the first true crack in the armor he had worn for 30 years. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to save the land from Henderson or the bank. He was fighting for a future that for a fleeting second he could almost dare to imagine. The floodwaters finally surrendered the land, pulling back with a slow, muddy sigh to reveal a world coated in a thick, slick layer of silt and tangled debris. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, but beneath the devastation, the fields had survived. In the quiet aftermath, a fragile peace settled between him and Leo, an unspoken truce born from shared struggle and mutual exhaustion, their previous tensions washed away, for now, by the deluge. A few days later, a crisp white envelope appeared, tucked into the dented flap of his mailbox. It was a note from Henderson. The handwriting was as neat and controlled as the man himself, the request simple. A package had been mistakenly delivered to his place. A deep-seated wariness immediately surfaced. Every interaction with Henderson felt like a strategic move on a chessboard, and he had long suspected the man of coveting his land. Despite his misgivings, he went, his boots sinking into the still, soft ground on the path to his neighbor's property. The contrast between their worlds was stark. His own farm was a scene of organized chaos, a testament to the recent, desperate fight against nature. Henderson's place, however, was tidy and impeccably organized, its neat fences and clear pathways a quiet rebuke to the disarray of his own life. Henderson met him on the porch, his face impassive, as he pointed a calloused finger toward a cardboard box. "Had to run into town," he said, his tone gruff. "Office is open if you want to wait inside." It was not a warm invitation. It felt like a test, a baited hook left dangling in the humid air. For a moment, he considered just taking the box and leaving, but a powerful, undeniable curiosity gnawed at him. He stepped across the threshold into the quiet coolness of the office. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and wood polish, a scent of permanence and order. And there, positioned squarely in the center of the mahogany desk, as if on a stage, lay an old leather-bound ledger, intentionally left open. He knew with a chilling certainty it was no accident. His gaze fell upon the open page, and his breath caught. His own name was written there in faded ink, right alongside another, Eleanor. The elegant script detailed a plan, sketched out with hopeful precision 31 years ago. It was a proposal for a land trust, a shared pact to forever protect Harmony Creek from outside developers. He remembered it all in a painful rush, the passionate proposal and the ugly, prideful words he had hurled, fueled by a jealousy he could never admit. The truth, laid bare in the old ledger, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Henderson had never been trying to steal his farm. After all this time, after decades of silent animosity, he was simply patiently trying to save her dream. The truth, when it finally came, did not liberate him, it shattered him. It was a seismic event that sent cracks racing through the very foundation of his being. For 3 decades, he had lived in a fortress of solitude, its walls mortared with righteous anger and its towers built upon a single, solid narrative. He was the wronged man. That narrative was his bedrock, the story he told himself in the silence of the long nights and the heat of the summer fields. Now, in an instant, it was all pulverized into dust. The lie was not Henderson's, but his own. The anger, a bitter fuel that had kept his heart beating through 30 years of isolation, evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying void. He felt not just empty, but frail, as if his bones had turned to brittle glass. He began the walk back to the farm, but it was a journey through a landscape he no longer recognized. The world had tilted on its axis, the familiar path reeling beneath his feet, the trees leaning at impossible angles against a jaundiced sky. Every rustle of leaves, every call of a distant bird seemed to mock the futility of his long-held grudge. Henderson had never been the enemy. The man he had cursed for a generation was merely the steadfast keeper of a promise he himself had forced from Eleanor, twisting her love into an obligation she could not escape. The weight of this new reality was immense, settling deep into his marrow, a cold and heavy burden of his own making. The righteousness was gone, replaced by the sickening acid of self-recrimination. He reached the mailbox by the gate, his hand trembling as he reached inside, more from habit than expectation. His fingers brushed against another envelope. This one was different from the last. It was crisp, official, bearing the clean, sharp-edged font of the bank's logo. A cold dread, separate from the emotional devastation he was already enduring, snaked around his heart. He knew what it was before he tore it open: the foreclosure notice. The final date was set, a clinical, impersonal deadline for the end of his world. It was a final, devastating blow that completed his ruin. He had lost everything all at once. The farm, the acres he had worked until his hands were cracked and his back was permanently bowed, was no longer his. But the loss was so much deeper than land and property. He had lost the grudge that had defined him. He had lost his very identity. Who was he if not the wronged man? He was nothing, a ghost adrift on land that had already forgotten him, a spectral presence haunting the edges of a life that had ceased to be his own. He found Leo by the porch steps, the boy's small figure absorbed in the simple, hopeful act of skipping a stone across a puddle. The sight of that innocent focus was a pain too sharp to bear. When he spoke, his voice was a hollow echo from the empty chasm inside him. "You should go," he told the boy, the words costing him the last of his strength. "There's nothing left here." He looked past Leo, at the fields, at the barn, at the house that was no longer a home. "I have nothing left to offer you." It was the truest thing he had ever said. Contrary to every expectation, Leo did not turn to leave. He remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, showing no hint of the surprise that should have registered upon seeing a life in ruins. Instead, he simply stood there, a silent, weathered sentinel, watching the protagonist with ancient eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades and untold secrets. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken history and the sharp odor of despair, before Leo finally moved with a slow, deliberate grace. His calloused hand reached into the inner pocket of his worn flannel shirt, a familiar garment that seemed a part of the man himself, and emerged with a single, folded piece of paper. This one was starkly different from the first. Its creases were deeper, threatening to tear the yellowed, fragile paper as if it had been carried for an eternity, absorbing the warmth, sweat, and constant worry of its keeper. He held it out without a word, an offering that felt both solemn and terrifying. Only then did Leo speak, his voice a low, soft rasp, yet underscored with an undeniable, unyielding firmness. "She said I should only give you this one when you had nothing left to lose." The words were not an explanation, but a key, unlocking a door the protagonist never knew existed. His fingers felt strangely distant as he reached for the note, numb and clumsy as they brushed against Leo's rough skin. The paper was impossibly light, yet it landed in his palm with the gravity of a tombstone, a final testament. As he carefully unfolded it, his breath caught. He immediately recognized her elegant handwriting, but it was a ghost of its former self, shakier, the confident loops now fraught with a desperate tremor that spoke of a battle waged against both time and the body itself. The words scrawled on that fragile page did not merely offer new information. They detonated the very foundations of his reality, recontextualizing his entire life in a blinding, painful flash of truth. The irreversible decision he had cursed for years, the devastating financial ruin for which he had harbored such bitter, soul-corroding resentment, was revealed to be a fiction. It was not a betrayal, but the ultimate act of love. A painful narrative she had meticulously crafted for the sole purpose of saving him from a truth he could not have borne. The fortune had not vanished into a foolish, failed investment as he had been led to believe. Every last cent, every shared dream and hard-won penny had been poured into a desperate, last-ditch experimental treatment for a degenerative illness. It was a familial spectre, the same cruel, silent disease that had stolen her own mother years before, condemning her to that definitive silence from which there was no return, a fate she had fought with everything she had to spare him from sharing. On the porch steps, as the sun began its final, fiery descent, he read the letter again. The paper, softened by the repeated passage of his fingers, felt fragile, much like the reality he had inhabited for 3 decades. The words swam and blurred through a veil of tears he did not know he still possessed, each one a chisel chipping away at the monument of his grievance. With a clarity that was both searing and devastating, he understood. She had chosen to bear the full, terrible weight of his anger rather than endure the lighter yet more corrosive weight of his pity. The secret she had kept was not a betrayal. It was not an act of deception meant to wound him. It was, he now saw, her final and fiercest act of love. It was a sacrifice, calculated and absolute, designed to set him free from the slow, soul-crushing agony of a bedside vigil she knew he was not built to endure. She had faced her own mortality alone, gifting him an enemy in her place, a tangible target for the pain that would have otherwise consumed him. His primordial wound, the one he had meticulously nurtured for 30 years, the very foundation of his identity, was a phantom limb. The relentless ache that had defined his existence was the ghost of an amputation he never knew he'd had. He had mourned a lie. Those 3 decades of bitterness were not a sentence she had imposed upon him. They were a prison he had painstakingly built around himself, brick by lonely, resentful brick. Every memory he had curated, every opportunity for forgiveness he had scorned, was just another stone in the wall, sealing him away from the truth, from her, from himself. The life he had lived was a self-inflicted exile. As the last sliver of light vanished from the sky, leaving the world in a wash of purple and grey, the final truth settled upon him. The silence he had kept, the heavy, punishing silence he had wielded like a weapon for all those years, was not for her. He had not been protecting her secret or punishing her supposed transgression. It was the profound and obstinate silence of a man who had categorically refused to listen. His ears and his heart had been closed all along. She walked in a daze to the old oak tree and stood at the edge of the hole she had dug, a chasm of her own making. It looked dark and strangely inviting, a perfect home for the ghost she had been. She could just lie down in it, pull the dirt over herself, and cling to the familiar pain of the victim. It would be the easy way out. But then her gaze drifted back toward the house. Leo was sitting on the porch steps, a small, patient silhouette against the warm light spilling from the kitchen. He hadn't simply brought her a letter. He had carried her very salvation across a dusty road. He was a promise, not of what had been lost, but of everything that could still be found. Suddenly, forgiving Eleanor was the easiest thing in the world. The hardest forgiveness was the one she had to grant herself for the 30 years lost to a story she had written and then trapped herself within. He took a deep breath of the evening air, the dust in his lungs feeling less like a sickness and more like the soil of home. Turning his back on the grave, he walked across the field, his steps feeling lighter than they had in his entire adult life. He did not stop at his own porch, but kept walking, all the way to Henderson's house, where a light was on. When Henderson came to the door, his face wary, the man simply held out his hand. He understood in that moment that his legacy would not be this land, but this choice. They would not fill the hole with a ghost. The next morning, he and Leo hauled buckets of rich soil from the creek bed and tipped them into the empty space. Then, together, they planted sunflowers, their faces destined to follow the light. His story was no longer about a hole in the ground. It was about the choice of what to grow there instead.